Roman boy is being handed to the enemy. He is 8 years old. He does not cry. He has been told not to cry because Romans do not show weakness in front of barbarians, and because his father needs him to be useful, and because the men watching this exchange are assessing everything, the boy's bearing, his composure, whether Rome is sending something valuable or something disposable. The Visigoths take him without ceremony. He is not a prisoner. He is a guarantee. His life exchanged for a treaty. His body, the physical proof that Rome will honor its word. If Rome breaks the agreement, the boy dies. That is the arrangement. That is diplomacy in a world where paper means nothing and flesh means everything. He will spend years among them. He will learn their language. He will learn to ride the way they ride, low on the horse, loose at the hips, moving with the animal rather than against it. He will eat their food and sleep in their camps, and understand from the inside what it means to be the thing Rome fears most. Then Rome will call him home. Then they will send him to the Huns and do it again. His name is Flavius Aetius. By the time Rome is finished with his education, he will be the most dangerous man in the Western world, and the only one capable of saving it. He will stop the one enemy Rome cannot stop by any other means. He will hold the empire together through 30 years of chaos, with nothing but his own capability and the relationships he built in barbarian camps as a child. Rome will thank him with a sword, not Attila's sword, not a Hun blade, or a Visigoth spear, the emperor's own sword, in the imperial palace, in the middle of the afternoon, 3 years after Aetius saved everything. When it was done, a court advisor looked at what remained and spoke. "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The words will be recorded and survive 15 centuries. The empire lasted 22 more years. Then it did not. The empire that lasted 22 more years was already dying before Aetius was born. Not the Rome of the histories, not the legions and the aqueducts and the roads running to the edge of the known world. That empire was already a memory. What remained in the late 4th century was a bureaucratic shell, vast, expensive, increasingly unable to defend its own borders, held together by inertia and the weight of its own history more than by any genuine institutional strength. The problem was simple and had no solution. The empire was too large to defend with the army it could afford, and too poor to afford the army it needed. The legions that had conquered the known world had been replaced by something different: federated barbarian troops, Germanic warriors fighting under Roman commanders for Roman pay, men whose loyalty was personal and contractual rather than institutional. They fought well. They fought for whoever paid them. When the money ran out or the commander died, the calculation changed. The emperors were not helping. The 4th and 5th centuries produced a succession of Western emperors who were children, incompetents, or both, men elevated by court factions for their manageability rather than their capability, rulers who reigned in palaces while generals fought the actual wars. The real power in the late Western Empire was not the man on the throne, it was the man commanding the armies. The Romans had a word for this. They called him the patrician, the generalissimo, the man behind the emperor, the man who actually decided whether the empire survived another year. Aetius was born into a family positioned to produce exactly that man. His father Gaudentius was a senior military officer, a commander in the Roman cavalry who moved through the frontier zones where the empire's actual work was done. The family was connected, ambitious, and understood that survival in the late empire required a specific kind of flexibility, the willingness to work with the barbarian peoples pressing against the borders rather than simply fighting them. This understanding shaped what happened to Aetius as a child. He was sent as a hostage to the Visigoths at approximately 8 years old. The arrangement was standard late Roman practice. Treaties with barbarian peoples were secured not with paper, but with people. A Roman officer's son sent to live among the Visigoths was Rome's physical guarantee that it would honor its commitments. If Rome broke the agreement the child paid with his life, the Visigoths sent their own noble sons to Rome under the same arrangement. Both sides understood the transaction perfectly. What neither side could have predicted was what the transaction would produce. Aetius spent years among the Visigoths. He learned their language. He learned their fighting style, mounted, mobile, built around individual warrior skill, rather than the disciplined formations that had made Roman infantry devastating. He learned how they thought about war and alliance and loyalty and betrayal. He came back to Rome speaking Gothic as fluently as Latin, with an understanding of Visigothic military culture that no Roman officer trained in the conventional system could match. Then they sent him to the Huns. This was different. The Visigoths were a settled people, Germanic warriors who had crossed into Roman territory, been defeated, been absorbed into the frontier system. The Huns were something Rome had never encountered. They had appeared from the eastern steppe in the late 4th century, and their arrival had set the entire barbarian world in motion. The Visigoths had fled into Roman territory, partly because the Huns were behind them. The Huns did not build cities. They did not farm. They were nomadic cavalry warriors whose entire civilization was organized around movement and violence. The most effective light cavalry force the ancient world had produced and possibly has ever produced. Aetius spent time in the Hunnic court as a young man. He rode with them. He learned their composite bow, a weapon that could penetrate Roman armor at ranges Roman archers could not match, fired from horseback at full gallop with accuracy that seemed impossible to anyone trained in the static archery of Mediterranean warfare. He learned their tactics, the feigned retreat that drew pursuit into ambush, the encircling movement that turned a pursuing army into a surrounded one, the speed of decision that made Hunnic commanders seem to act before their enemies had finished thinking. He also met the man who would one day become Attila. The exact nature of their relationship during these years is not recorded in sufficient detail to be certain. What is certain is that Aetius and Attila knew each other. They had been in the same camps. They had spoken the same language. They had grown up in the same military culture. Attila absorbing the Hunnic tradition from inside, Aetius absorbing it from outside, both of them developing the instincts of the steppe warrior while serving different masters. When they finally faced each other across a battlefield in Gaul in 451, they were not strangers. They were two men who had spent their youths in each other's worlds, who understood each other's thinking, with a clarity that made the battle between them something different from ordinary warfare. It was not civilization against barbarism. It was two products of the same education, fighting for different outcomes. But that moment was still decades away. When Aetius returned to Rome from the Hunnic court, he was in his mid-20s, obscure, connected to powerful families, but not yet powerful himself, with a head full of knowledge that Rome did not know it needed yet. He was about to spend the next 3 decades making himself indispensable. The Western Empire in the early 5th century was fracturing along predictable lines. The Visigoths had settled in southwestern Gaul, nominally as Roman federates, practically as an independent kingdom. The Burgundians controlled the Rhine frontier. The Franks pressed from the north. The Vandals had crossed into Africa and taken Carthage, cutting off the grain supply that had fed Rome for centuries and the tax revenue that had funded its armies. Every year, the empire controlled less territory and commanded less loyalty from the peoples theoretically within its borders. Aetius navigated this landscape the way he had learned to navigate Hunnic politics, through personal relationships, through understanding what each faction wanted and what they feared, through the patient construction of alliances that served Roman interests without requiring Roman strength to enforce them. He made himself useful to every major power in the West. He made himself dangerous to every major power in the West. He was the man you needed if you wanted something done in the frontier zones, and the man you feared if you considered moving against Rome. He was also the man the empire kept trying to destroy. He survived 2 attempts to remove him in the 420s and 430s through a combination of political skill and the one asset no rival could match: his personal relationship with the Huns. When Roman court factions moved against him, Aetius withdrew to the Hunnic court and returned with Hunnic cavalry at his back. The factions that had tried to remove him found themselves looking at the force they feared most and reconsidered. It was a spectacular demonstration of what his years among the Huns had bought him. He was using the empire's greatest threat as his personal insurance policy. By the 430s, he was the patrician, the generalissimo, the man behind the emperors, the actual power in the West. He held the position for 20 years. He fought continuously against the Visigoths, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Bacaude revolts in Gaul, the endless small wars of the frontier. He won more than he lost. He kept The remaining pieces of the Western Empire in some kind of functional relationship with each other through force of personality and the constant threat of Hunnic backing. He was doing the impossible. He knew it. The court knew it. The emperor knew it. That was the problem. A man who does the impossible long enough becomes something the system cannot contain. Valentinian III had grown up in the shadow of Aetius. He had watched the patrician make decisions that should have been imperial decisions. He had watched other men defer to Aetius rather than to him. He had been the emperor in name while someone else ran the empire in fact. 20 years of that produces a specific kind of resentment. The resentment of a man who knows he is outmatched by someone who serves him and cannot forgive it. In 450, the situation changed. Attila moved west. The decades of Hunnic alliance that Aetius had used to stabilize his own position were over. The Huns were no longer his insurance policy. They were the existential threat he now had to stop with whatever remained of the Western Empire. What remained was not much, but it was enough, if you knew how to use it. And there was only one man who knew how. What one man could do with the wreckage of an empire was about to be answered. Stick around until the end, and subscribe if this is your kind of history. What he was facing crossed the Rhine in early 451, with an army that contemporary sources describe in terms that sound like exaggeration and probably are not. The Huns did not come alone. They never came alone. Attila's empire was a confederation, Huns at the center, surrounded by subject peoples who fought under his banner because the alternative was to be destroyed by it. Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Siri, the same Germanic peoples Rome had spent generations fighting were now marching under a Hunnic king toward the heart of what remained of the Western Empire. The estimates of his total force range from 100,000 to several 100,000. The exact number does not matter. What matters is that nothing in the Western Empire could match it in open battle. He sacked Metz on April 7th. The Bishop of Rheims was killed at his own altar. The city of Tongeren was destroyed. The Huns moved through northern Gaul with the specific efficiency of a force that had been doing this for decades. Not raiding, not plundering opportunistically, but systematically eliminating resistance and demonstrating to every city in their path what the cost of defiance looked like. Then they turned south toward Orléans. Orléans mattered because of geography. It controlled the primary crossing of the Loire River, the gateway to Aquitaine, where the Visigoths had settled. If Attila took Orleans, he could drive between the Romans and the Visigoths, destroy them separately, and the coalition Aetius was trying to build would collapse before it could form. Attila understood this. Aetius understood this. The race to Orléans was the actual opening of the campaign, not the battle on the plains in June, but the desperate march south that determined whether there would be any coalition left to fight. Aetius was already moving. What he had to work with was genuinely inadequate for the scale of what he was facing. The regular Roman forces in Gaul were a fraction of what they had been a generation earlier. Undermanned, underpaid, fighting a dozen small wars simultaneously across a frontier too long to properly defend. He could not stop Attila with Roman soldiers alone. He needed the Visigoths. The problem was that the Visigoths had spent the previous 40 years as Rome's enemy, almost as often as Rome's ally. Theodoric I, the Visigothic king, had fought Aetius personally in the 430s. They had made peace, broken it, made it again. The relationship between Rome and the Visigoths was one of mutual suspicion, built on a foundation of genuine conflict. Asking Theodoric to march his army north under Roman command against a Hunnic force that might be larger than both their armies combined was not a diplomatic request. It was an act of persuasion that required Theodoric to trust a man he had fought in service of an empire he had sacked against an enemy whose defeat would leave the Visigoths dependent on Roman goodwill. They had no reason to trust. Aetius made the argument anyway. The argument was simple and true. Attila was not coming for Rome. He was coming for everyone. The Huns did not distinguish between Roman and Visigoth. The subject peoples in Attila's army included Ostrogoths, Theodoric's own kinsmen, conquered and conscripted. If Attila won in Gaul, the Visigoths were next. The choice was not between fighting Attila and avoiding the fight. The choice was between fighting him now with Roman support or fighting him later alone. Theodoric agreed to march. This was the achievement historians consistently undervalue when they describe the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The battle itself was fought in an afternoon. The coalition that made the battle possible took 30 years to build. Aetius had spent his entire career accumulating the personal relationships, the mutual obligations, the reputation for reliability that made it possible to walk into a Visigothic court and ask for an army. He had fought alongside these peoples and against them. He had honored agreements when honoring them was costly, and broken them when breaking them was necessary. He had made himself the one Roman that the barbarian kingdoms on the frontier believed. That belief was the actual instrument of Rome's survival in 451. Not the legions, not the walls, not the institutional weight of the empire. One man's credibility accumulated over a career spent on both sides of the frontier. He added Franks, Burgundians, Alans, Sarmatians. By the time the coalition was assembled, it contained peoples who had been fighting each other for generations, united by the calculation that Attila was worse than any of them. 2 years before the battle, a Greek historian and diplomat named Priscus of Panium had traveled to Attila's court as part of an Eastern Roman diplomatic mission. He wrote down what he saw. His account is the closest thing to a first-hand portrait of Attila that survives. A man of short stature, with a large head and small eyes, who walked with pride and surveyed everything around him with rolling eyes that communicated the full weight of his own power. At the feast, Priscus attended. Attila ate from a wooden plate while his guests ate from silver. He drank from a wooden cup while the room drank from gold. The plainness was deliberate. It communicated that he needed none of it, that the man himself was the wealth, not the objects around him. Priscus also recorded something that stayed with him. Among the people at the Hunnic court, he met a man who had been Roman, a merchant from the Eastern Empire who had been captured years earlier, had won his freedom through service in Attila's campaigns, and had chosen to stay. Priscus asked him why. The man told him that life among the Huns was preferable to life in the Roman Empire, that among the Huns a man's fate depended on his own capability and courage, while in Rome it depended on the corruption of officials and the accidents of court politics. Priscus was disturbed by this. He argued with the man. He defended Rome. He listed the achievements of Roman civilization, the laws, the administration, the protections offered to citizens. The man listened politely and remained where he was. Aetius had said nothing so direct, but he had made the same calculation in reverse. He had lived among the Huns and returned to Rome, not because Rome was better, but because Rome was his. He understood what Priscus's merchant understood. He had simply chosen differently. That choice, to serve a system he knew was corrupt, to hold together an empire he could see was dying, to use everything. The barbarians had taught him in service of the civilization that had sent him to them as a child, was the choice that made him irreplaceable. It was also the choice that killed him. They reached Orleans on June 14th. Attila's forces were already inside the outer defenses, had breached sections of the wall, and were preparing the final assault that would open the road south. The timing was close enough that contemporary sources describe it as miraculous. Attila withdrew. He was not going to fight a siege battle with a Roman Visigothic coalition arriving at his back. He moved northeast onto the open plains where his cavalry could operate. He was looking for ground that suited the Huns. What he found, or what Aetius ensured he found, was the Catalonian plains near Troyes. Open ground, room for cavalry, the kind of battlefield where the Hunnic way of war was most effective. This looked like Attila's choice. It was not entirely Attila's choice. He had studied Hunnic tactics his entire adult life. He knew what ground they preferred. He also knew something Attila may not have fully accounted for, that the ridge running across the battlefield gave whoever controlled it a decisive advantage, and that a Roman general who had spent his youth riding with the Huns knew exactly how to use that ridge against them. The night before the battle, Attila's seers sacrificed an animal and read the bones. The reading was not good. The Huns would lose, but a great enemy commander would die. Attila interpreted this as meaning Aetius. He decided to fight. Both armies moved for the ridge on the morning of June 20th. The Romans got there first, not by much. The Visigothic cavalry on the Roman right flank reached the crest just ahead of the Ostrogoths on Attila's left, and the fighting for the high ground was immediate and brutal. The battle that followed was one of the largest and bloodiest of the ancient world. Sources describe rivers running red, corpses covering miles of ground, casualties so heavy that neither side could immediately assess what had happened. What happened on the ridge determined everything. The Visigoths broke through. They drove the Ostrogoths back and swung toward Attila's center. They came close enough to Attila himself that he retreated to the wagon circle, the traditional Hunnic defensive formation, wagons chained together in a ring. The force inside prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. In the chaos of the breakthrough, Theodoric was thrown from his horse. His own cavalry, surging forward in the charge, did not see him fall. He was trampled to death by the force he had led into battle. His death was not discovered until nightfall. Attila was inside the wagon circle ordering a funeral pyre built from saddles. He was not going to be taken alive. He was going to burn. The pyre was never lit. Aetius did not order the assault that would have finished everything. The most debated decision in the entire battle, the choice that historians have argued about for 15 centuries, was not a tactical decision at all. It was a political one. Destroying Attila completely meant destroying the Hunnic threat permanently. It meant the coalition Aetius had assembled had no further reason to exist. It meant the Visigoths, now the dominant military force in Gaul after their performance on the ridge, had no reason to remain subordinate to Roman authority. A dead Attila was a Rome dependent entirely on Visigothic goodwill, with no counterweight available. A retreating Attila was still a threat. A threat meant the coalition still had a purpose. A purpose meant Rome still had leverage. Aetius let him go. Attila crossed back over the Rhine. He was alive. His army was battered but intact. His aura of invincibility was gone. He had been stopped, turned back, forced to retreat for the first time in his career. The plains near Troyes were covered with the dead of both armies, and the Hunnic Empire was still, standing. It would not stand for long, but not because of what happened on the Catalonian plains. What killed the Hunnic Empire was what always kills empires built around a single man. The man died. Attila died in the spring of 453, not in battle, not from a wound taken on the Catalonian plains, or in the Italian campaign that followed. He died in bed on his wedding night, a nosebleed according to the most widely accepted account that he choked on in his sleep while drunk. The greatest military threat the Western world had faced in a generation died aspirating his own blood in the dark. The Hunnic Empire he had built through 30 years of conquest and terror began to collapse within months. His sons fought over the succession. The subject peoples, the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Rugians, who had marched under his banner because they had no choice, rose against his heirs the moment the personal authority that had held them in place was gone. The Battle of Nidau in 454 ended Hunnic dominance permanently. The confederation Attila had assembled dissolved into its component peoples, each carving out their own territory in the former Hunnic lands. Within 2 years of Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire existed only as a memory and a warning. The Western Roman Empire should have been celebrating. It was not celebrating. It was doing what the Western Roman Empire had spent the previous century doing, consuming itself. The court factions that had been suppressed during the emergency of Attila's invasion were active again. The resentments that had been set aside when survival required it were no longer set aside. And at the center of all of it was the same calculation that had been building for 20 years. Aetius was too powerful. Valentinian knew it. The court knew it. Everyone who paid attention to the actual distribution of power in the Western Empire knew that the patrician, the man who had just stopped Attila, who had just demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that the empire survived because of him and not because of its institutions, was in a position that no emperor comfortable with his own authority could tolerate indefinitely. In 454, Aetius proposed a marriage alliance. His son, Gaudentius, would marry Valentinian's daughter, Eudocia. On paper, it was a dynastic proposal, the kind of arrangement that had been common in Roman politics for centuries, a way of binding the general class to the imperial family, a gesture of loyalty expressed through family connection. Valentinian saw it differently. A marriage alliance meant Aetius's son would be the emperor's son-in-law. It meant Aetius's grandchildren might have a claim to the imperial succession. It meant the man who already ran the empire in fact was now positioning his family to run it in name. Whether this was Aetius's actual intention is not recorded with enough certainty to be definitive. What is recorded is Valentinian's reaction. and the advice he received from a court official named Heraclius, who told the emperor that the time to remove a man too powerful to challenge politically was before he became powerful enough to challenge militarily. Valentinian listened. He would act before the year was out. On September 21st, 454, Flavius Aetius attended a meeting with the emperor in the imperial palace at Rome. The meeting was not unusual. Aetius attended such meetings regularly, reporting on military matters, discussing finances, the routine business of running an empire that depended on his management. He arrived without unusual guard. He had no reason to expect what happened next. Valentinian stood up from his seat and drew his own sword. What followed was not an execution. There was no charge read, no verdict rendered, no ceremony acknowledging what was being done and why. Valentinian attacked Aetius personally. His chamberlain Heraclius joined in, the man who had stopped Attila, who had held the Western Empire together through capability, and will and the relationships he had built in barbarian camps as a boy. That man died on the floor of the imperial palace, stabbed by the emperor he had spent his career defending, without a trial, without a formal accusation, without anything that even resembled the institutional processes of the civilization whose survival he had made possible. He was somewhere in his mid-50s. The exact date of his birth is not recorded precisely enough to be certain. He had run the Western Empire for 2 decades. He was killed in an afternoon. When it was done, a senior official looked at what Valentinian had just accomplished and spoke the line that would outlast both of them. "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Valentinian appears to have believed he had solved a problem. He had removed the man he feared. The empire was still standing. The military was still there. The frontier arrangements Aetius had maintained were still in place. He seems to have assumed the arrangements would continue without the man who had built and maintained them. He was wrong about this in a way that became visible almost immediately. The men who had served Aetius did not transfer their loyalty to the emperor who had killed him. 2 of Aetius's former bodyguards, men named Optila and Thrausila, Hunnic warriors who had served under the patrician, were among the imperial guard. 6 months after the murder of Aetius, on March 16th, 455, Valentinian was watching a military exercise on the Campus Martius when Optila and Thrausila stepped out of the guard formation and killed him. The right hand had been cut off. 6 months later, the left hand followed. The Western Roman Empire survived both deaths. It had survived everything: the sack of Rome in 410, the loss of Africa, the invasion of Attila, the murder of its greatest general. It was extraordinarily durable in the way that institutions built over centuries become durable. They persist through disasters that should destroy them because the accumulated weight of their history is itself a form of momentum. But momentum without direction is just movement. And without Aetius, there was no one left who understood how to direct what remained. The 22 years that followed were not a managed decline. They were a series of collapses. Military commanders elevated and removed. Emperors made and unmade by barbarian generals. Territory lost not in battle, but by default, as the administrative and military systems that Aetius had kept functional stopped functioning. The Vandals sacked Rome in 455. The frontier arrangements in Gaul dissolved. The tax base that funded the army shrank as the territory that paid taxes shrank. The army shrank as the tax base shrank. The territory shrank as the army shrank. In 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. His name a cruel combination of the founder and the first emperor, ruling over nothing, and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. He did not bother to appoint a replacement. There was nothing left to replace. The Western Roman Empire was over. It had taken 22 years to finish what one afternoon in a palace had started. The historians who came after spent centuries arguing about why Rome fell. They blamed the barbarians. They blamed Christianity. They blamed lead pipes and moral decay and the overextension of the frontier and the debasement of the currency. They produced libraries of explanation for a collapse that had many causes, and one moment, one specific afternoon in 454, when a paranoid emperor drew his own sword and removed the last man holding the structure together. The arguments are not wrong. The empire was weakened by all the things the historians identified. The finances were broken. The frontiers were too long. The institutional loyalty that had made the legions invincible had been replaced by contractual arrangements that dissolved when the contracts stopped being honored. These were real problems that preceded Aetius and would have outlasted him. But real problems can be managed by capable men. Rome had survived real problems before. It had survived civil wars and plagues and military disasters that should have ended it. It had survived because at each crisis, there was someone with the capability and the authority to hold the remaining pieces together long enough for the crisis to pass. After 454, there was no one. This is the thing Valentinian could not understand, because he had never understood where the empire's actual strength came from. He thought it came from the throne, from the imperial title, from the institutional weight of Rome as an idea. He thought that removing Aetius would leave the empire intact with a vacancy at the top of the military hierarchy that someone else would fill. No one filled it. No one could fill it. Aetius had not been doing a job that any competent general could perform. He had been doing something that required a lifetime of specific preparation. The hostage years among the Visigoths, the years among the Huns, the personal relationships with every major barbarian leader on the frontier, the credibility accumulated through decades of keeping his word when it was costly and breaking it only when survival required it. He was not replaceable because what he was could not be replicated on short notice. It had taken his entire life to make him what he was. When Valentinian's sword ended that life, it ended something that could not be rebuilt in the time the empire had left. 22 years, then nothing. The boy who had been handed to the barbarians as a hostage had grown up to be the only guarantee that mattered. He had taken everything Rome gave him, the discipline, the language, the military tradition, and combined it with everything the Huns had given him. The tactical instinct, the cavalry warfare, the understanding of how the steppe peoples thought and fought and could be managed. He had built from those two educations something that neither Rome nor the Huns could have produced alone. A Roman who thought like a barbarian who served Rome. The precise combination the late empire needed and could not have manufactured deliberately. And he had used that combination to stop the one man who could have ended everything a generation earlier. Attila never came back. After the Catalonian plains, he invaded Italy, sacked Aquileia, threatened Rome itself, turned back before reaching the city for reasons that are still debated. Disease in his army, supply problems, the arrival of an Eastern Roman force on his flank, Pope Leo I riding out to meet him and somehow persuading him to withdraw. Whatever the reason, Attila retreated across the Alps and died the following year without fighting another major Western battle. The threat he represented died with him. The Hunnic Empire collapsed. The Western Empire had survived, and then killed the man responsible. The question Aetius's life keeps asking, the one that does not resolve cleanly, is whether any of it mattered. He stopped Attila. The empire died anyway. He built the coalition. The coalition dissolved. He held the frontier for the better part of 3 decades. The frontier collapsed in 22. If the outcome was the same, regardless, was the effort wasted? Was the man wasted? The answer depends on what you think history is for. If history is only outcomes, then Aetius was a man who delayed an inevitable collapse by a generation and died for it. The Western Empire fell. The knowledge he carried died with him. The arrangements he maintained stopped the moment he stopped maintaining them. The right hand was cut off, and the patient bled out slowly over 2 decades. The end was the same. But a generation is not nothing. The 22 years between Aetius's death and the fall of Rome were 22 years in which the Christian Church consolidated its institutional presence in the West. 22 years in which the barbarian kingdoms settling into former Roman territory were absorbing Roman law, Roman administration, Roman language. The Visigoths and the Burgundians and the Franks who carved up Gaul did not replace Roman civilization. They inherited it, imperfectly, partially, but genuinely. The world that emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire was not the Hunnic steppe. It was something that carried Roman foundations into what became medieval Europe. If Attila had won in 451, that inheritance would have looked different. How different is the question that cannot be answered. But the historian John Julius Norwich wrote that in the summer of 451, and again in 452, the whole fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. The man who kept it from falling was Aetius. Rome cut off its right hand. The hand had been doing work the body could not survive without. The body discovered this too late to matter. And the advisor who said it, the man who looked at what Valentinian had done and spoke the line that outlasted both of them, was not making a metaphor. He was making a diagnosis. The patient had removed its own vital organ and called it surgery. The boy being handed to the Visigoths on a cold frontier road could not have known what he was being prepared for. He did not know that the years among the Huns would give him the one thing Rome could not manufacture, a mind that understood the empire's greatest threat from the inside. He did not know that this understanding would one day save everything. He did not know that saving everything would not be enough. Rome did not fall because of Attila. Attila was stopped. Rome fell because the system that produced Aetius could not tolerate what it had produced. It built the instrument of its own survival and then destroyed that instrument because the instrument had become too powerful to feel safe around. That is not a barbarian failure. That is not an external pressure. That is a civilization making a choice. It made the choice. It lived with the consequences for 22 years. Then, it did not live at all. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Could Rome have survived without Aetius? Or was the collapse inevitable the moment the empire stopped being able to accommodate the men it needed most? And does it change how you see the fall of Rome, knowing it was not Attila who delivered the killing blow? History has been arguing about it for 15 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.